The New Jersey sun, a pale, anemic thing in the late October sky, was doing its best to cut through the grime on my office window. It wasn't winning. Neither was I, if I'm honest. I stared out at Hopewell, the picture of small-town America, a postcard town, if the postcard was slightly faded and dog-eared at the edges. Main Street, with its quaint shops and the old movie theatre turned into a performance space for the local arts council, looked peaceful enough. But peace is a thin veneer, easily scratched. I knew that better than anyone. 5 years since my life went sideways. They called me the X-Files agent behind my back, the one who chased aliens and lost his grip. Truth is, I never lost my grip. I just saw things others didn't, connections others refused to acknowledge. My gift was pattern recognition. I could sift through the noise, the seemingly random data points of human behavior, and find the underlying thread, the narrative that tied it all together. It made me a damn good profiler, one of the best in the Bureau's behavioral analysis unit, until it didn't. Another sleepless night, courtesy of the ghosts in my head. They were chatty tonight, whispering about the old case, the one that landed me here in this self-imposed exile, chasing cheating spouses and insurance scams instead of whatever it was I'd been chasing back then. The disappearances had started just like these. No forced entry, no ransom notes, no sign of a struggle, just gone. Vanished. Back then, it was a string of seemingly unrelated cases, each dismissed as a runaway, a domestic dispute gone wrong, a tragic accident. But I saw the pattern, the subtle anomalies that linked them. The victims were all active on certain online forums, obscure corners of the internet where people discussed things. Unexplained phenomena, government conspiracies, alien abductions. Crazy stuff according to my superiors. But I dug deeper, learned their language, their fears, their beliefs, and I found a thread, a hint of something else. Something that was watching, studying, maybe even taking. I pushed the thought away, but it clung to me like the smell of stale coffee in my office. My wife had left a long time ago. She couldn't stand me always working on these cases. She wanted a different life. She was married before me, and she got remarried a few years later. She lives in Arizona now. I haven't seen her in a while. My office was a monument to that obsession. A corkboard covered one wall, a chaotic collection of newspaper clippings, printed out forum posts and blurry photos of, well, things. Things in the sky, things on the ground, things that didn't quite fit the official explanations. A faded FBI commendation hung crookedly beside it, a relic of a life I could barely remember. My desk, a scarred oak monstrosity I'd picked up at a yard sale, was buried under stacks of files, old case notes and half-empty coffee cups. I lived on coffee and takeout these days, mostly from the diner down the street. Mary, the owner, knew my order by heart. 2 eggs over easy, bacon, rye toast, and a coffee the colour of midnight. She never asked about the files, the late nights, the haunted look in my eyes. She just poured the coffee and left me to my ghosts. I sighed, pushing away from the window. Time to face the day. I grabbed my worn leather jacket, the one I'd had since my early days at the Bureau, and headed out. The walk to the diner was a ritual, a chance to observe the town, to take its pulse. Hopewell was a microcosm of America, a mix of old families and new arrivals, blue-collar workers and white-collar commuters, hope and despair, all wrapped up in a Norman Rockwell-esque package. The town had a timeless feel, with old brick buildings and tree-lined streets. I walked past the old Pennington Bagel. I stopped there to grab some breakfast. I ordered a plain bagel with cream cheese and a black coffee. As I ate, I noticed a woman in the corner, visibly distraught and talking to one of our local officers, a young guy named Peterson. She was clearly upset, her voice trembling as she spoke. I caught snippets of the conversation. "Just gone. No note. Not like him." Peterson was calm and professional. but I could see the concern in his eyes. He was out of his depth. I knew the feeling. After finishing my bagel and coffee, I felt the need to gather information. I decided to head to the Hopewell Public Library. It wasn't just a hunch, it was the familiar pull of an unsolved puzzle. The library, a stately old building with towering shelves and the hushed atmosphere of a cathedral, was my sanctuary. I bypassed the main desks and headed straight for the computer terminals. I navigated the familiar back alleys of the internet, the forums and chat rooms where the truth resided, or at least a version of it. Sightings of strange, silent drones, not just here in Jersey, but across the country. People were sharing stories, comparing notes, their fear rising even through the digital veil. These weren't the usual hobbyist drones or the delivery drones that Amazon was testing. These were different. The descriptions, the photos and videos sent a shiver down my spine. They matched the drones in my old files, the ones I'd been ridiculed for even mentioning. I spent hours immersed in the online chatter, compiling data, cross-referencing reports, mapping the sightings. The pattern was undeniable. The drones were appearing in specific areas, staying for a few days and then vanishing. And shortly after they left, people started to disappear. The disappearances were random, cutting across all demographics. No rhyme or reason, no apparent connection, except for the drones. I felt that familiar surge of adrenaline, the thrill of the chase, the intoxicating pull of the unknown. It was like a drug, this need to know, to understand, and it was about to drag me back into the darkness. Later that day, the call came. A gruff voice I barely recognized, filtered through years of static and bad memories. "Corbin, it's Ashton, Agent Charles Ashton." My stomach clenched. Ashton, a by-the-book ambitious agent, the kind who saw the world in black and white, regulations and procedures, everything I wasn't. "We have a situation in Hopewell," he continued. "A situation I think you might be interested in." He knew, of course. They all did. My reputation preceded me. "A body was found, or what's left of one," he added, a hint of something in his voice. Disgust, maybe, or fear. I could hear the sounds of sirens in the background. "It's unusual." "Unusual how?" I asked. "Just get down here, Corbin, and try not to embarrass us both." He gave me the location, a wooded area on the outskirts of town, near the Sauerland Mountain Preserve. I hung up, my heart pounding. The game was on. Ashton's words echoed in my mind as I drove towards the Sauerland Mountain Preserve. "Try not to embarrass us both." As if I cared about embarrassing the Bureau. They threw me out like yesterday's trash the minute I started talking about things they didn't want to hear. Still, a part of me, a small, stubborn part, wanted to prove them wrong. Not for them, but for me. To prove I wasn't crazy. I gripped the steering wheel, the weight of my old service weapon, a Glock 19 I somehow managed to keep, a comforting presence against my hip. It wasn't standard procedure for a PI, but these weren't standard circumstances. I found them easily enough. A cluster of police cruisers, their flashing lights painting the trees in an eerie glow. The scene was crawling with local cops. Peterson, the young officer from the bagel shop, recognized me and nodded. He'd seen the missing person reports, the growing list of names. He knew this was something beyond a simple missing person case. Ashton, true to form, was standing apart from the others, his arms crossed. "Corbin," he greeted me, "you took your time." "Had to change into my alien hunting outfit," I replied. "Wouldn't want to disappoint." He didn't rise to the bait, just gestured towards the woods with a curt nod. "It's this way. Prepare yourself. It's not pretty." I followed him, the scent of pine needles and damp earth filling my nostrils. The woods were dark, the only light coming from the flashing police lights and the beams of our flashlights. We walked in silence, the only sounds the crunch of our shoes on the fallen leaves and the distant murmur of voices from the other officers. The body was something else. It wasn't just dead, it was hollowed out like a husk, a discarded shell. The skin was withered, the color of aged parchment. But it was the patterns that caught my eye. Hexagonal, like a circuit board etched into the skin. They were raised, almost glowing. I'd seen those patterns before in my old files, in the photos from the online forums. "What the hell is this?" Ashton breathed. He looked pale, even in the dim light. "I think," I said, my voice low, "that you owe me an apology." He didn't apologize. Not then. But he didn't argue either. We spent the next few hours at the scene working alongside the local police, though it was clear they were out of their depth. I examined the body, careful not to disturb anything. The patterns were precise, geometric, too perfect to be natural. They seemed to follow the underlying musculature of the body, branching out like the veins of a leaf. There were no signs of struggle, no external wounds, just those unsettling patterns and the emptiness of the body. It was as if something had been extracted, leaving behind only a shell. My office became our unlikely war room. Stacks of files, maps dotted with pushpins, and the glow of my computer screen replaced the usual detritus of a struggling PI. Ashton, surprisingly, adapted quickly. He shed his tailored suit jacket, rolled up his sleeves, and even started drinking the sludge I called coffee. It was a start. We were an odd couple, the disgraced agent and the by-the-book Fed. But the husks, the drones, the disappearances, they were a common enemy, a threat that superseded our differences. He held our only copy of the first husk, the photos displayed on his phone, the hexagonal patterns, stark and unsettling against the withered skin, seemed to shimmer in the low light. He'd seen them himself, touched them, but the photos brought the reality of it crashing home again. "There has to be a logical explanation," he muttered. It was his mantra, his desperate attempt to cling to a world that made sense, a world where the FBI had all the answers. "There is," I said, pulling up a chair beside him. "It's just not the explanation you're used to." I pulled up the latest reports of the drones from the internet. "Look," I said, pointing to the screen. "Sightings all over the country. Different states, different demographics, but always the same drones and always followed by disappearances." He studied the reports, his eyes scanning the data. I could almost see the gears turning in his head, trying to reconcile this with his training, his experience, his worldview. The official FBI stance, as he'd briefed me, was cautious, bordering on dismissive. They acknowledged the disappearances, the strange circumstances, but attributed them to a new, unknown criminal element, possibly using advanced technology for abduction and murder. They were grasping at straws, trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. Then came the call that changed everything. Dispatch patched through a frantic voice to Ashton's phone. A farmer named Joseph Fisher, found unconscious in a field bordering the Sauerland Mountain Preserve. He was alive, but barely. They said he was burned, but not like any burn they had ever seen. We were out the door in seconds. At the hospital, Fisher was in intensive care, his body a patchwork of bandages. The doctor, a young woman with tired eyes, described his condition as critical. "It's like his insides were cooked," she said, shaking her head. "But there's no sign of external burning, no radiation. We don't know what we're dealing with." We got permission to speak to him just for a few minutes. He lay in the bed, his face pale and drawn, his eyes filled with a terror that went beyond physical pain. He was hooked up to a dozen machines, their rhythmic beeping a grim soundtrack to his suffering. It came from the sky," he whispered, his voice raspy. "Black, like a giant beetle, but silent, no sound at all." He squeezed his eyes shut, his body trembling. It was like it was trying to squeeze the life out of me, like it was trying to take something, my essence. He started to sob, a low sound that tore at my gut. Then it screamed, a terrible sound, and it just flew away. Ashton, for the first time since I'd known him, looked genuinely lost. He stared at Fisher, his usual composure shattered. "Where did it go?" he asked. "The woods," Fisher whispered. "It crashed. In the woods." That was all we needed. We left the hospital. The image of Fisher's terrified face burned into our minds. The woods were dense, the trees looming like silent sentinels. The air was heavy with the scent of pine and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, like overripe fruit. It was a smell I would come to associate with them. We found the crash site about a mile into the preserve, following a trail of broken branches and disturbed undergrowth. The drone was partially buried in the ground. It was about the size of a small car, but its presence was overwhelming. It was clearly not of this world. Its design was both organic and mechanical, a seamless fusion of smooth, curved surfaces and sharp, angular edges. There was a gaping hole in its side, where it had apparently malfunctioned, revealing a glimpse of the machinery within. It looked like wires and circuits, but moved like organic sinew. We approached cautiously, our senses on high alert. The drone was silent, inert, but there was a faint hum emanating from it, a low thrumming that vibrated in the air. I noticed hexagonal patterns on the ground around the drone. They were similar to the ones on the husks, but less defined, as if the energy that created them had been disrupted. Ashton took out his phone, snapping pictures, documenting every detail. "We need to call this in," he said. "This changes everything." He was right. The discovery of the drone was a turning point. It was concrete proof, undeniable evidence that we were dealing with something extraterrestrial. Ashton contacted his superiors, and the full weight of the FBI descended upon Hopewell. The crash site was cordoned off, a perimeter established, and a team of specialists, flown in from God knows where, arrived to secure the drone. They wore hazmat suits and carried all sorts of high-tech equipment. They worked quickly and efficiently. It was clear they had done this before, somewhere else. The secrecy was absolute. No one, not even Ashton or I, was allowed near the drone while they worked. We were kept at a distance, our questions met with stony silence. They loaded the drone onto a flatbed truck, covered it with a tarp, and drove it away, disappearing into the night as quickly as they had arrived. The destination, we later learned, was Area 51. While we waited for the report, we dove back into the investigation. We interviewed dozens of residents, anyone who might have seen or heard something unusual. We pored over maps, satellite images, anything that might give us a clue about the drone's movements, their motives, their next target. The local library became our second home. I spent hours in the archives, sifting through old newspapers, property records, and historical accounts, searching for any mention of similar events in the past. I found a few intriguing tidbits, stories of strange lights in the sky, unexplained disappearances, peculiar patterns found in fields, but nothing that offered concrete answers. Whisper, my online informant, was working overtime, feeding me a constant stream of data. Satellite imagery, leaked reports, analyses of the drone's movements. He was my eyes and ears in the digital world, and he was starting to paint a disturbing picture. The drones were not random. They were following a pattern, a spiral that was slowly expanding outwards from Hopewell. Finally, a week after the drone's removal, the report arrived. It was delivered to Ashton in a sealed briefcase, handcuffed to the wrist of a stone-faced courier, who looked like he hadn't slept in days. The report was heavily redacted, entire sections blacked out, but what remained was enough to send a chill down my spine. The drone was confirmed to be of extraterrestrial origin, its technology beyond anything known to man. The chitinous metallic composite shell, the microhydraulic filament musculature, the neural pathway processing system. It was all described in meticulous detail. The report speculated that the drone was powered by a biocapacitor, a device that could store and release energy from organic matter, explaining the sweet smell we had detected at the crash site. But it was the section on the hexagonal patterns that truly caught our attention. The report identified them as a bioresidue, a byproduct of the energy used by the drone to extract something from the victims. The process, the report suggested, targeted specific proteins and enzymes, possibly related to DNA or some other vital biological element. The patterns were a kind of signature, a trace left behind after the extraction. The drones were not just killing people, they were taking something essential, leaving behind only empty shells. And they had been doing it, undetected, for an unknown amount of time. The implications were staggering. We were not dealing with a simple case of abduction and murder. We were facing an existential threat, an alien invasion on a scale we couldn't even comprehend. Ashton and I stared at the report. We were two men standing on the edge of an abyss, staring into the unknown. We had found the truth, or at least a part of it, and it was more terrifying than we could have ever imagined. We had to stop them. We had to find a way to fight back before they finished whatever this is. But how do you fight an enemy you don't understand? An enemy that can appear and disappear without a trace. An enemy that can turn you into an empty shell with a touch. We were so close. We had the evidence, the analysis, the pattern. Ashton and I, fueled by lukewarm coffee and a shared sense of desperate purpose, were huddled over the map in my office, the one with the expanding spiral radiating out from Hopewell. Each pushpin represented a disappearance, a husk, a sighting of the drones. It was a roadmap of their silent invasion. "They're nearly done here," I muttered, tracing the spiral with my finger. "One more sweep, maybe two, and they'll have covered the entire area." Ashton nodded, his face grim. "We need to get this to the higher-ups, not just my immediate superiors. Someone who can bypass the usual channels, someone who will listen." He was working his contacts, trying to find a way to cut through the red tape, the bureaucratic inertia that seemed to protect the truth as fiercely as it protected the status quo. Over the next few days, a strange stillness began to settle over Hopewell. It wasn't a peaceful quiet, not the gentle lull of a town at ease. It was a heavy, expectant stillness, like the hush that falls before a storm. The drones were still there, at least we assumed they were, but their sightings became less frequent. Days turned into weeks. We kept waiting for the next shoe to drop, the next disappearance, the next sighting, but there was nothing. The last confirmed sighting of a drone had been over 2 weeks ago, a fleeting glimpse captured by a security camera on the outskirts of town. Since then, silence. It was a different kind of silence than before. Not the tense quiet between sightings, when we knew they were out there, hunting. This was a deeper, more unsettling silence, the silence of absence. The online forums, usually buzzing with reports and speculation, became quieter. The initial fear and urgency slowly giving way to doubt and disillusionment. Even Whisper seemed to have gone dark, his cryptic messages replaced by an ominous silence. I found myself constantly scanning the skies, half expecting to see them, but the sky remained stubbornly empty. It was as if the drones had simply evaporated, leaving behind a void that felt both unsettling and strangely final. The disappearances had stopped. There were no new husks. And then the official explanation arrived, disseminated through the usual channels, news outlets, government press releases, even a carefully worded statement from the FBI. Mass hysteria, they called it, a collective delusion brought on by stress, social media, and an overactive imagination. The events in Hopewell, the disappearances, the husks, the drones, it was all attributed to a combination of factors: a rare atmospheric phenomenon, a new type of hallucinogenic drug, an elaborate hoax perpetrated by a group of pranksters. Anything but the truth. They even trotted out a few experts to lend credence to their claims, psychologists and sociologists spouting jargon about the power of suggestion and the dangers of online conspiracy theories. Hopewell, on the surface, was returning to its sleepy, idyllic self, but beneath the veneer of normalcy, an undercurrent of unease remained, a lingering question mark hanging in the air. Had the drones truly gone? Or were they simply elsewhere? Ashton was reassigned, shipped off to some desk job in DC, a clear message to keep his mouth shut. He called me before he left, his voice strained, apologetic. "There's nothing I can do. I tried to push it up the chain, but they shut me down. Hard. They even classified the Area 51 report, said it was a misinterpretation of data related to a classified project." I could hear the defeat in his voice, the frustration of a man who had seen the truth but was powerless to act on it. He had glimpsed behind the curtain, and the powers that be had swiftly pulled it shut again, leaving him in the dark. "It's not over," I told him, my voice tight with a conviction I wasn't entirely sure I felt. "This was just a phase. A test, maybe. They collected what they needed, for now. They'll be back." "I hope you're wrong, Miles," he replied, but there was a tremor in his voice, a hint of uncertainty that betrayed his true feelings. He knew. Deep down, he knew. We both did. I was alone. Again. Just like 5 years ago, when my obsession with the truth had cost me everything. My career, my reputation, my marriage. Now history was repeating itself, but on a much grander, more terrifying scale. The drones had become my new white whale, my obsession, and I was Ahab, lashed to the mast, sailing into a storm of denial and disinformation. My office became a graveyard of unanswered questions, a memorial to a truth that had been buried alive. The maps, the files, the photos of the husks, the printouts from the online forums, they were all still there, mocking me with their silent presence. But I couldn't let it go. I couldn't just accept the official narrative, the blatant lies that were being fed to the public. I had seen the truth, touched it, smelled it, that sweet, metallic scent that clung to the crash site, to the husks, to the memory of the drones. I continued to monitor the online forums, the dark corners of the internet, where the truth still lingered, faint and fragile, but alive. Whisper was still out there, a ghost in the machine, feeding me scraps of information, rumors, whispers of similar events in other parts of the world. Sightings of strange drones, disappearances, husks. It was happening elsewhere, quietly, secretly. But it was happening. I began gathering everything I knew, every scrap of evidence, every conversation with Ashton, every cryptic message from Whisper. I documented it all, a thorough report of the events in Hopewell, a declaration of the truth that had been so ruthlessly concealed. It was a dangerous game, a solitary crusade against a powerful, unseen enemy. But I couldn't stop. I was driven by a need to understand, to prepare, to warn the world even if no one would listen. I felt like a modern-day Cassandra, cursed to see the future but unable to make anyone believe. Weeks turned into months. The memory of the drones began to fade from the public consciousness, relegated to the realm of urban legends and conspiracy theories. Hopewell slowly returned to its sleepy, idyllic self, the scars of the invasion healing, at least on the surface. But I knew it wasn't over. The silence was not a sign of peace. It was a lull, a pause before the storm. The drones had completed their mission for now, but they would be back. They were out there, somewhere, studying us, planning their next move. One evening, while working late in my office, poring over data from various scientific organizations, specifically meteorological reports and unusual energy readings from around the globe, I received a message from Whisper. A single line, cryptic and chilling. They're back. Along with it, a link to a local news article from a small town on the outskirts of New York City. It wasn't about disappearances this time, but something equally strange. A farmer had reported a peculiar formation in his cornfield, a series of concentric circles that appeared overnight. Unlike typical crop circles, these were not flattened stalks, but rather a change in the corn's pigmentation, as if the chlorophyll had been selectively drained, leaving behind a washed-out, almost translucent pattern. The farmer described it as looking like a giant's thumbprint pressed into the field. Local authorities dismissed it as a prank, but the intricate detail of the pattern, captured in aerial photos taken by a local news drone, was eerily familiar. Within the circles, etched into the very pigment of the corn, was the same hexagonal pattern we had found on the husks in Hopewell, the distinctive bioresidue, a byproduct of the energy used by the drones. I stared at the photos, a cold unease settling in my stomach. They're back. The words echoed in my mind, a terrifying confirmation of my deepest fears. The drones were not simply vanishing or moving on. They were observing, studying, perhaps even testing their methods, leaving behind a subtle, almost invisible calling card. And the location, so close to one of the most densely populated cities in the world, felt far too significant to be a coincidence. Were they testing human response time outside the immediate area where harvesting was done? Were they preparing for something bigger? A new harvest on an unprecedented scale? I knew I had to continue my research alone. I had to figure out their next move before they made it. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and began to plan. The drones might have won this round, but the war was far from over. I would not let their silence become our epitaph. Hopewell had been a trial run, a test, and somewhere, out there in the vast emptiness, they were preparing for the main event. Humanity's final harvest was coming.